Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Great of you to be here. I'm going to just linger a second to welcome you all and announce the subject of the lecture tonight. It's going to be Assyria in the minds of modern Western historians. And by modern, I mean also, 19th century when Assyria was first being rediscovered and dug up its cities. Not fair to say Assyria because the land had always kind of existed there, but this is, the major cities that were destroyed. So within this, I want you to think about all of these people who conceptualized Assyria in their minds, all of these writers, these scholars, these thinkers, these analysts, who were working on cuneiform tablets and working on Assyrian history, on Assyrian art. What were they thinking? And what was their reaction to this culture? And so I want to ask a question of Sarah and Pierre, who are my trusty assistants. And that question is first, Sarah, to you. These early writers and thinkers and theologians and historians, theologians pretending to be historians, and historians who were also theologians, and others looked at Assyria with a certain amount of awe and contempt. As an Assyrian, modern Assyrian today, where do you think this came from? Where was the source of this awe and contempt from about Assyria?
Okay. Thank you, Rabi, for the question. Well, as an Assyrian, I see that the awe and contempt of 19th century Western authors toward Assyria, something like intertwined with really their own colonial fantasies and Orientalism, of course, which we've continuously touched on throughout these classes. But yes, on one hand, there was awe, as you mentioned, and knowing that this all was fueled by the rediscovery of ancient Assyria through these archaeological digs, that again revealed, the elements of a great empire. And to them, I think Assyria represented something of splendor and might. And I feel as though this romantic fascination with the East kind of enabled these European powers to, in a way, oddly enough, make connections between their own empires and the Assyrian one to ultimately kind of validate their colonial ventures in a way. But as we know, the awe quickly turned to contempt when they interpreted Assyrian history through, which I've mentioned, through a like kind of a moralizing and Eurocentric lens. They flipped the narrative and saw Syria as a very sinful and morally bankrupt civilization. And they basically began to stress Assyria as like a cautionary tale of people who were essentially so arrogant that they were punished by God, and ultimately use their fall as a justification for Western civilization superiority. But I guess to bring it all back and think about how this all makes me feel as an Assyrian, it's difficult not to feel the weight of these contradictions the more I immerse myself in the history. I mean, it's really all around us today in academia and how we understand our own history. It feels as though really our history is kind of, centered through a specific perspective that was never really ours to begin with. But like for myself personally, I'm proud of the legacy of our ancestors, their art, their innovation. But I can't help but instantly think about the reality of how, Western authors assign specific narratives about the Assyrians. But also, I did think about this. I recently read a book titled Heathen, which kind of correlates with this Orientalist reception of Assyria. The book is by Catherine Ginlum. I hope I'm saying her name right. But in the book, she kind of argues that the term heathenism was not really just a religious label, but it was also kind of racialized and applied a moralizing frame kind of used by Westerners to construct the idea that all non-Western people were backward and in need of domination. But this sort
Mm.
of logic kind of just reminded me how those authors, those 19th century authors, kind of depicted Assyria grand, yes, but also scorned. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
just something I wanted to throw in, somewhat of a similar comparison, but I'll stop here.
Yeah, very interesting, very observant, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're referring to the white man's burden of having to care for the lesser races of mankind. So, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of that, and we're going to challenge that in the lecture today. We're going to see, were they really? Was everyone kind of seeing this Assyria, this new discovery, the same way as we've come to know, as analyzed by people like Edward Said through an Orientalist lens and others, of course? Or was there a more nuanced approach to Assyria? So we're going to develop that a little bit. And within the context of that, Pierre, there was an article written in 2006 by Professor Eckhart Fromm, who is of Yale University. In this article, he outlined kind of the history of the development of the study of Assyria. And he said first, and we'll talk about it a little bit today. He narrated how initially it was the people who kind of guessed about Assyria, and then it was, based on biblical and classical sources. And then there were the discoveries, and people began to have a new perspective of Assyria, and this developed into, having a Bible-centered view of Assyria. And then the pendulum swung the other way, and then there was kind of a more favorable view of Assyria. And he tells us in the analysis, modern scholars have concerned themselves too much about the contributions of the culture and faith of the Assyrians, and not enough about the dark side. What is this dark side? How do you understand it? And what is Eckhart Fromm talking about?
Well, to me, Eckhart Fromm is referring to the militaristic and imperialistic, how would I say this, aspects of the Assyrian Empire, in the sense that he wants to discuss empire, conquest, violence that came to be associated with Assyria. When you really look at it, though, it's just a failure to put things into context when he calls this dark aspects. It's sitting and having a moral high horse sitting right now in the 21st century and retroactively applying it to the Assyrian Empire, which was no different than any empire in its time, let alone any empire in history. I mean, we've talked about this previously in the course when we talked about the Roman Empire was known for propagating crucifixions, to say, don't rebel, this is what happens to rebels, this is what happens to thieves, for example. Or even the Hebrew Bible, when it mentions and it discusses the Jews need to kill all the people, including the animals of such a group that opposed Yahweh. In the same way, you see this with modern empires. I mean, just to think about America, what was the point of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It was to tell the Japanese, do not fight, surrender. America's the unchallenged superpower. You're better off joining, not fighting. That was the point of the Assyrian Empire's propaganda with its violence. And with obviously writings surviving of this propaganda that might have been used, we start to get an application of the Assyrian Empire's this violent, dark state. But in reality, again, from what we know, it was really no different from any other state. So why shouldn't we talk about its cultural achievements becomes the bigger question. It's actually, this is my sort of working theory on it, is Eckhart Fromm, I believe he's German by ancestry with his name. He would grow up in something that would probably be a more Protestant, Western leaning lens of the world, where Assyria was depicted as an enemy due to the Old Testament, a very simplistic reading of the Old Testament, if I might say, where you start to see the Jews are the good guys of the Old Testament when they're not. Time after time, they forsake God. It's a lesson to be learned. And the Assyrians are the bad guys for being the rod of God's anger. You know, that's what we're interpreting the lens of why the Assyrians have to be the bad guys. And it's actually a bit even unfair because how has modern scholarship treated the Babylonians as scholars, as this great state? But the Bible seems to actually indicate the Babylonians are also bad in the eyes of the Jews. I mean, it talks about Babylon is this place of decrepit decrepit morals and all these things that are falling apart in Babylon. It's actually really a sort of weird double standard that's developed, even though it's not entirely biblically based. Part of it is. So what Eckhart Fromm wants us to talk about is what he wants to talk about. With it's his field of study, and he thinks it's applicable to talk about that. But in reality, we know from other people, as historians have developed, and thinking about states and thinking about states as rational actors, we realize Assyria is not so black and white. History is not so black and white. History is filled with shades of gray. In reality, white and black mix. You see a lot of, good and bad. I mean, the Belgian Congo, the Belgians were cutting off Africans' hands. We don't seem so willing to talk about that all the time. We talk about, oh, look at Belgium, this great peaceful European Union state that's, the ideal state that everyone should live in these days. Instead, we want to sit and retroactively apply a moral lens of the 21st century, which we're not any better than those empires that existed in the past. We just have more technology. We want to sit and apply these things to Assyria, which is inapplicable and dishonest. So personally, that would be my full take on that.
Good. Thank you. What you said about that is very interesting because there was this comment made on a video that talked about current conditions, and I saw the exact same, maybe it was you who responded in the comment section that said, nothing's changed since the time of Napoleon and even earlier about conquest, just the weapons have changed. So, I mean, yeah, of course, in this class, there was one of the responses to one of the videos we had done was, at the end of the day, you're defending these Assyrian kings, which I was not, but I would defend the truth about Assyrian kings. At the end of the day, they were dictators. And I thought, autocrats are dictators. And I thought, well, you have to be familiar with history to really place things in context here. And just to label one people having dictators or autocrats is completely unfair. Or to say, to kind of paraphrase Eckhart Fromm, that, we have to, if we're going to look at the cultural achievements of the Assyrians, let's make sure that we also look at their dark side. Something that we can say about every single culture, I guess. And I asked you before, could this be, simply human nature? Is this what you're talking about, human nature, rather than, the so-called dark side of a people? So
just to even add on to that, I mean, that's a good point to think about human nature. It goes to what I said about states are rational actors. So much like human beings, states are flawed. States are made up of human beings. And in the same way, they are prone to sin, prone to violence, prone to things that might even be like what we might call selfishness, aka self-preservation. And states, in order to do that, will do whatever to preserve themselves. So if it comes at propagating violence, which, if I'm going to speak strictly as a Christian, we shouldn't propagate violence, of course. But again, a state is a set made up of people. And in the same way, the state is also prone to sin. It's ridiculous that we need to try and apply this moral standard to states that has never, ever, ever existed in history until now, when we want to start retroactively pretending that it was the case.
Yeah. And, and I'll refer to this in the lecture today. Assyria has much more diplomacy than we give it credit for. It's just that the diplomatic images haven't really been passed down to us. What's been passed down are the interesting images of, the lion hunts and the wars and so on and so forth. But the record And you would be interested in this, Pierre, as a law student. We as lawyers always talk about creating a record. And the Assyrians created a record that eventually came to be quoted against them. I would say misunderstood, but nevertheless, there's one announcement I just want to make, and Sarah reminded us that on August 7th, we're going to focus on Assyrian Martyrs Day, what that is about. And I will record a lecture, and the rest of the show will be conducted by Mr. Pierre Younan and Miss Sarah Gawo of the Ashurbanipal Library, and so that should be very interesting. So with that, let's dig into Assyria in the minds of modern historians of the West, largely. So first, I want to take off with this quote that Eckhard Fromm gives us. He says, when people thought about Assyria, when we first begin to discover Assyria, we get our views from primarily two sources. From Jerusalem, the religious beliefs of the West came, and from Athens, their methods of thinking, and from Rome, their political organization. I should say three, but Greece and Rome are often grouped together as classical. The tone was set by the Bible. Babylon was the mother of whores and of every obscenity on earth, quote unquote. That's Revelation. And Nineveh was the bloody city, all full of lies and booty. And now I want to tell you, please put this in context, because certainly this is not everything that the Bible has about the Assyrians or of the people of Babylon. It's a glimpse into and one section into a larger picture about the Assyrians. And we've quoted at length about other passages here. Well, in the mid-19th century, when we get the discoveries of Assyria, and we begin to see the artistic achievements and the architectural achievements and other achievements of the Assyrians, these massive walls of cities and so on and so forth, we begin to think a little differently about Assyria. So historical stereotypes came under attack, and clear boundaries, we are told, between us and them became blurred, according to one historian. As a result of the decipherment of these scripts of the ancient past, things we've never heard before, there was a challenge to traditional understandings held by many in the West. Because remember, as it was said before, the views came from the Bible, and where the tone was set in certain places in the Bible, I wouldn't say every place, but certain tones were set by certain sections of the Bible and some classical sources. Assyria's image in the Bible was, according to this article, largely negative, but not free from contradictions. Assyria was the agent of divine wrath and then fell to the same divine wrath. But in the meantime, one has to ask oneself, what exactly was the point of this divine intervention through Assyria to begin with? So one needs to think deeply about it, because the punishment meted out against the Assyrians, this divine wrath that they experienced, wasn't really because they were cruel. Cruelty was just okay, because cruelty was carrying out the order of God, as it were. It was about claiming credit for oneself, being haughty, being arrogant about the achievements of the Assyrian king. So it wasn't really cruelty. It was achieving, or it was taking the position that we are the ones who should get the credit and not God. The classical tradition conveyed a more ambiguous image. And again, it's not Assyrians who were bad in the Bible, or the classical sources. It was certain rulers of the Assyrians. This is very important. It should be something that we distinguish. And Lord Byron is one very interesting character who kind of um, uh, takes off in this story. He writes The Destruction of Sennacherib in 1815. And in this story, of course, the Assyrians are made to seem very bad. Okay, they're really completely unacceptable as people who are villainous and so on and so forth, and they eventually are destroyed. It's a story basically of Sennacherib's coming to the city of Jerusalem. And then he writes in 1821, so that's 1815. 1821, he has a more nuanced view towards Assyria. He talks about this is the play Sardanapalus, and Sardanapalus, in this, the protagonist is really his alter ego. Whatever he was suffering from comes to be viewed through a lens looking at the last great Assyrian king, Sardanapalus. So the destruction of Sennacherib, many of you are familiar with this. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold. So kind of like, the Assyrians are preying. They're the predators, and other people are suffering as a result. And then, of course, the Assyrians lose, and he tells us, and the widows of Ashur are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. Now, the temple of Baal is, of course, a reference to others, but never mind, it's not the Israelites who suffer, it's the Assyrians. So Baal is associated with the Assyrians mistakenly here, but it's interesting. It's a play, it's a fictional, it's a poem, it's a fictional poem. So there's a lot of stuff made up. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, had melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. So that's the end of the Assyrians. Now,
Even to mention something ironic, sorry, about Lord Byron. Lord Byron, a notable Hellenist, he admired the Greeks and thought that they were these morally superior people and they deserved the help of the Europeans to free. So much so that he went and fought in the Greek War of Independence. Most of the Greeks he was fighting with, who he portrayed as noble, were nothing more than jumped up bandits who were known for robbing people at the time. So it's very funny how he wants to portray, oh, the Assyrians deserve to get destroyed. Look at this, how they're destroyed by God punishes them. But he, for some reason, loves the Greeks, who also in the Bible and in the book of Maccabees are portrayed as a very destructive and cruel force.
well, but they were Europeans.
Right. So that makes it okay. Right. That makes it okay. It's just to notice. The first thing that pops up is the contradiction in Lord Byron's thought.
Well, we're going to see this again and again in the pattern of how the Assyrians are viewed and how they are judged, and again. I mean, there's a clear pattern here. By the way, in this sketch, before I get to the points, you see a number of people wearing these conical hats. What do you think these are? Are these Arabs digging up these or Kurds?
Well, you told us who they were last time, Robert.
Yeah, I did. All right.
I mean,
all right.
but I think most of us know these were the hard mountain laborers that Layard brought in, who he felt that they were more suitable for the work of digging up for the rubble rather than what he portrayed as effeminate Kurds and Arabs.
Well, he didn't say effeminate, Pierre, but I would say that he did, and others, Claudius Rich and others, mentioned that the Assyrians were physically stronger than other people living in the area. So it's just very interesting. I don't want to belabor this point. So these excavations cast light on the Assyrians themselves, showing thousands of images created by them. This was something that we hadn't seen before. Scholars, rather than poets and kind of dramatists like Lord Byron, came to write on Assyrians. There was an attempt to seek the real Assyria in the West. And of course, there was always this struggle, okay, biblical lens, classical writers, these are non-Europeans. There was always this struggle, but there was an attempt to seek the real Assyria. there was and we're told from the promise of objectivity was difficult to keep. In fact, Assyria continued to be studied not for its own sake, so not this autonomous field of study, but for its links with the classical world. Little mistake there. Links with the classical world, and even more so with the Bible. That's why people took so much interest in Assyria. One of those who took an interest was the Protestant clergyman and theologian, and that's George Rawlinson, who is the brother of Henry Rawlinson, who wrote a lot about the Assyrians. Both brothers had this view about the Assyrians, by the way. And that was that we are told by him in one of the books that he wrote, which was the most important, The Great Monarchies. The Assyrian monarchy exhibits to us a type of power at once enormous and irresponsible, swelling into cruelty and pride, which could not fail to provoke the vengeance of heaven. So remember, the cruelty is not the problem in the Old Testament. What's the problem is the pride, the taking credit from God. So when you are the rod of God's anger, you have to sort of accept that God is the one who judges, God is the one who acts, God is the one who takes credit. And very strange, by the way, Assyrian kings, when they would boast about their victories, who would they give credit to? It was to their gods that they give credit to throughout all of the writings that we have. And we're going to see this issue clarified in later or by later scholars. So major work related was to Assyria was the great monarchies of the 5 great monarchies, and then later 7 great monarchies. And now Chaldea. Chaldea is a term, by the way, used by a lot of these older writers, such as George Rawlinson and others. That was the term used in those days. It's no longer used. So whenever you see somebody using, an Assyriologist using Chaldea, you know he's talking about people writing in the past, not really modern Assyriologists don't use that term. They do use Babylonia, which is also, I think it's erroneous. The proper term is Somer and Ekkad. That's what that land used to be called. So, all right, we know what how he's thinking about Assyria. He's looking at through a biblical lens. And now Layard comes in. Layard has a little more nuanced view of Assyria, and Layard has a great imagination. And he tells us in one of the passages in Nineveh and its remains, these huge mounds of Assyria made a deeper impression on me, gave rise to more serious thoughts and more earnest reflection than the temples of Baalbek and the theaters of Ionia. A deep mystery hangs over Assyria, Babylonia, and Chaldea. With these names are linked great nations and great cities dimly shadowed forth in history, mighty ruins in the midst of deserts, defying, by their very desolation and lack of definite form, the description of the traveler. So one of the differences that Assyrian ruins had this impact on people like Layard is, well, we've seen the Roman ruins, we've seen Greek ruins, the various architecture that is left. We've even seen areas in, for example, Iran, Persepolis, but we don't quite see the Assyrian ruins in Nineveh because they're buried. And so Layard has this imagination of a lot of these ruins, and his view is a little more nuanced than the others. So at this time, after the discovery of these ruins, texts began to cast doubt, again, a mistake here, excuse me, on the details of the biblical narratives and Bible-based chronology that were reconstructed by people like Bishop Ussher. In 1847, a member of the Anglican Church protested that excavations of Assyria should stop because they had an impact on the credibility of the Bible, the stories of the Old Testament. So there was a movement also to kind of counter these discoveries that it's going to mess the picture up a bit. One very interesting character during this time whose views are, again, much more nuanced than that of, for example, George Rawlinson, is George Smith. This is the man who first began to translate the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and began to write about what he called the Chaldean account of Genesis. And of course, again, this term Chaldean, used by these older authors, is no longer in use. Neo-Babylonian is the term that is often used. So he's credited as the first person to read these texts that had been silent for centuries. And he tells us in an excited manner that I saw at once that I had here discovered a portion of at least of the Chaldean account of the deluge. So here again, we're going back to the Bible, but now George Smith is discovering something that wasn't discovered before, that the story of Noah, contained in Noah, the story of creation, is now being viewed from the Assyrian or Babylonian perspective, or Chaldean perspective. And he was so excited that it is said that he stripped his clothes off in excitement and when he read this, and this reflects how deeply he associated the text with biblical narratives and the validation of religious history. But again, he saw in this as something more nuanced. Not everything was totally believed here in the Bible by many of these authors. Another author that is of interest to us is Sayce, who was a British Assyriologist and linguist, and I believe he had a great impact on many of the writers, even today, in the way they think about Assyria. And it's interesting to see in his Assyria, its princes, priests, and people, descriptions of the Assyrian people compared to the Babylonians, because this is going to be a kind of a theme that appears again and again in history, and including in the latest book by Eckhart Fromm, who sees in Babylonian character a certain kind of more benevolent character, and in the Assyrian, a more warlike character. This is going to repeat itself among many writers, and up until, as I said, Eckhart Fromm. The Babylonian character was patient, peaceful, and laborious. They were content to leave the government of their country in the hands of their priests. Now, where he gets this exactly is stunningly interesting to me, but obviously, I mean, this is stuff that is, there's no other way to say it, made up. The Assyrians were a military people caring for little else save war and trade. They carried war into foreign lands and exacted tribute. Unlike, of course, the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians, they never, took tribute. The Assyrian was less religious than the Babylonian. Again, how you determine this from the sources that you have is incredible, but again, it's there. But more patriotic and energetic. All right, so all these terms clearly showing a contrast between this type of a human being and this type of a human being. And this is kind of, one could say it's Orientalism, but it's really just the categorizing of the Assyrians and the Babylonians as two separate peoples with two separate characters. And this is kind of just going to linger throughout history as a result of people like Sayce.
It's like you brought up last class, you brought up the Queen of Babylon. I mean, that whole film is meant on carrying those two tropes, essentially. And it's interesting, like you brought up. I mean, they know little about these actual societies and how they function, but instead they're applying this to further their own imagination about these states. About, oh, well, if one state, had this huge empire, the other state must have been much more about thinking. It's sort of applying a view of Athens and Sparta and sort of what that's become in our modern view as Sparta's this militaristic state that had no use for philosophy, and Athens was this philosophical state. But in reality, when we look into history, we see Athens becomes this empire, more focused obviously on the navy, but it has this empirical goals that it wants to establish. And Sparta has this sort of deep constitution that actually you don't really see in many other places. It comes back to history is not black and white, and instead far more complex.
Yeah, I mean, this desire to categorize, to stereotype, in effect, is very interesting, and definitely it comes through in the various writings of people like Sayce. And this is going to develop, of course, into something that is different as scholars take a more careful look at things. But yeah, that film that you brought up, which we discussed only briefly, I think that deserves a careful look at how Assyrians and Babylonians, or Assyrians and Chaldeans, were viewed differently in the past, how one represented one type of a human being and another type is definitely worth analyzing. So again, this idea that Assyrians really didn't accomplish anything, we see it in the work of Sayce. Assyrian religion was largely borrowed from Babylonia, and Eckhart Fromm regrettably uses terms like cannibalized. There's no trace of human sacrifices among the Assyrians, which is the more singular, since we learned that human sacrifice had been an Akkadian institution. Not true at all, of course, again, but very interesting. As to cultural output, Babylonia was the land of letters and culture. The great libraries of Kutha and Sippara were monuments of their learning. Assyria imported her culture and letters from Babylonia. Again, ideas that we'll see again and again in the past, even though I believe there's no historical justification for this. And I've had discussions with various Assyriologists on this, and I think I'd like to take this into kind of a conference setting where we have these views like, okay, where does this come from? As one who likes to see the sources and the exhibits to a point being made, where does it come from that the Assyrians were not interested in culture, didn't sort of invent culture, and the Babylonians were the ones who were kind of the authors of it? And Eckhart Fromm in his book, which we'll talk about in detail in one of the classes coming up, even says that one wonders why the Assyrians were so hostile to Babylonia, as if all of the Assyrians were kind of sitting around and thinking, how can we express our hostility to Babylonia as a whole, to every Babylonian citizen? And one of the reasons why it could have been is Babylonia was a much older kind of culture, much more of an intellectual culture, and so the Assyrians expressed their jealousy through this hostility. Nonsense. So Assyrian history was studied because it had something to say for the Bible, or about the Bible, or in connection with the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. The impulse to study Assyria for biblical confirmation was strongest in the mid-19th century, particularly during the rise of biblical archaeology, what eventually called biblical archaeology. This term, by the way, is no longer really an academic profession. These scholars, especially Laird, Smith, and Hinks, often approached Assyrian history with the hope that archaeology would substantiate sacred texts. This approach shaped the early reception of Assyriology, casting the ancient Assyrians as both villains of the Bible and proof of its historical reliability. And as I said earlier, that kind of changed. And the great transformation, the kind of rebellion against the way of thinking, came from German Assyriologist Friedrich Dilthey, who gave 2 lectures on Babel and the Bible. He was talking about Assyrian history and Assyrian texts, or Babylonian texts together, found in the Ashurbanipal library. Gave this lecture the first one, January 13, 1902, before the Emperor Wilhelm, the Kaiser. What he said was that the Hebrew Bible offered little more than a distorted rewriting of the stories and theological concepts that had their origin in Mesopotamia, in Assyria, and in Babylonia. Later, he suggested that the Old Testament should be completely abolished by the Christians in the modern age, and much of the material discussed was Assyrian. And given that we are told by, I didn't complete the sentence here, given that there was this Prussian militarism among Kaiser and others like him, that the Germans took to this and began to admire the history of Assyria much more, and looked at it in a different sorry, I just got a message that the sound keeps cutting off. Is that true?
It's for Sarah. Sarah's having internet connections. It's not for everyone. It's just
Oh, okay,
Sarah's
okay.
internet connections.
I just
You're totally fine for everyone else, I'm pretty sure, including
I
myself.
I just got the message. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries, Robert.
All right. So this particular Assyriologist began to kind of overturn views of that were held by many, particularly British and others, European scholars about Assyria and its connection with the Old Testament. And he really looked anew at the entire Assyrian history. He highlighted textual parallels between the story of Genesis, Noah and Gilgamesh. And his claim was that, look, the Old Testament comes from this source, and so we should kind of like go to the original source here, this this secondary kind of borrowing or cannibalizing, to kind of paraphrase Eckhart Fromm's phraseology. Cannibalizing this culture is really not the way to go. And now, this wasn't uncontroversial, by the way, even though it was kind of a rebellion against many known scholars and writings. There was kind of backlash that came also from Christians.
Even that, sorry, one more thing to bring up at this time that's
Sure.
occurring in the British Empire is this idea of British Israelism. I'm not sure if you've heard about it. I'll explain it to the class. British Israelism was the idea that the Anglo-Saxon race, which the British believed that, well, in a sense they are a part of it, but believed that this race actually descended from the Jews, and the British were carrying on this good guy narrative of the Israelites in the Old Testament. The British Empire is their successors, as the British are their genetic successors, and the Germans would actually be the Assyrians, the ancient evil Assyrians. This is where this comes to be, this association between Germany and Assyria. I mean, obviously, there's some more other ancient traditions that can be applied, but it becomes a big thing between Prussian militarism and Assyrian militarism. The Germans are cruel and barbaric, just like their forefathers, the Assyrians. And this comes to influence a lot of people in Britain, as many, many high-ranking British politicians and journalists and people across British society believed in British Israelism, quite popular in the late 1800s.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is what many people were also pursuing, these theories of the lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And we'll later talk about Asahel Grant's, placing that on the Assyrians to say that they were descendants of these lost tribes also. That's very, very interesting. All right, now let's move on and talk about, there was a more sort of balanced, one could say, view of Assyrian history after the First World War. There were publications of the Kültepe mound that was found, or the city that was found in Anatolia, which expressed, there were thousands of tablets found. This very fascinating story of the old Assyrian period, where the Assyrians conducted trade. Through these, the old period and the middle period of Assyrian history were better understood. And we are told by Fromm that it became clear that Assyrians had, quote, started their historical mission not as military conquerors, but as traders and businessmen operating from the city of Ashur. So after World War II, the bellicosity, imperial ambitions, and autocratic political systems, earlier regarded as legitimate by some authors and even laudable, were now seen as highly objectionable. In the democratic societies of the post-war period, the Assyrians were quite unsuitable to serve as role models. So again, the pendulum is swinging this way and that way. The disgust, we are told, some scholars felt when they had to deal with Assyria was strong. Some, we are told, even ignored Assyria altogether in many of the textbooks. Books on history in Mesopotamia said basically Assyria's cruelty had nothing good to contribute to modern society. Actually, you know, this thinking has been heard in museums by even curators, museum curators who take people on tours. I was one who heard people at the Oriental Institute talk like this, that Assyria basically was nothing more than a war machine and really had nothing to offer society. And you see it in books. And in case you're not, these are some quotes by some of these authors, in case you're not sure, Arnold Toynbee, who's thought to be although he was a philosopher, he's thought to be one of the greatest of historians, tells us that Assyria was a tyranny based on brute force and nothing else. So no intellect, no strategy, no, just brute force. And others say Assyrian kings gloried in cruelty. Their inscriptions gloat over how they tortured captives, flayed them alive, impaled them on, so on and so forth. I'm not going to quote all of these people. Will Durant, who many people should be familiar with, he wrote much on history. Assyrian history is a terrible record of savage warfare, cruel treatment of vanquished peoples, and unabashed enjoyment of massacre. It is all told in inscriptions with startling frankness. Now, this is not the man who actually wrote or read cuneiform sources, but he's looked at them and decided that this is really all they had to offer. Now, now we change. So recently, you know, a few years ago, we began to see something called the State Archives of Assyria, which began to translate many of these. And this was directed by Professor Simo Parpola, who has since retired. And he looked at Assyrian history through a different lens, very careful, thought out, not coming from an ideological perspective. Royal Inscriptions of Mesopotamia, directed by Kirk Grayson, that's the University of Toronto, Malamu Project. These presented new images of Assyria based on its culture and religion, largely, but also told its history from a very nuanced perspective. So scholars begin to portray Assyria as a cradle of civilization and a source of ideas for the Bible and Greece. And among them are Stephanie Daly and Martin West. Definitely a new look at Assyria, very different from what we saw before. And of course, one of these who has written this article in this book, Orientalism, Assyriology, and the Bible, his view is that the present author has the impression, he gets the impression, this is the question I posed to you, that recent scholarship has focused too much on cultural achievements of Assyria. That's very bad. And too little on the dark side of this remarkable state. We should not forget in our late discovery of the beauty and artwork and admiration for the administrative skills. So now the Assyrians are, he's acknowledging that they're good administrators. It's not just brute force. You had it all wrong. But there's still a dark side to this empire. And the Assyrians waged extremely aggressive wars rather than, I suppose, passive wars. deported whole populations from one end of their realm to the other, and killed large numbers of civilians. And of course, I don't think there's any person that would agree that that's regrettable and horrible. But the question is, are you selecting the Assyrians for this particular view that there's a dark side to the Assyrians that, for example, is not present in other civilizations? Does this dark side not represent, as I asked before, Pierre, human nature, in fact? And does it not represent the kind of consequences of empire all the way up to the present? I mean, I made a comment that, one person commented on a presentation about the modern age, about Ukraine and the situation in Israel and Gaza and so on, that, nothing has changed other than the weapons. And I think that people that, the scholar that you brought, Mearsheimer, understands, that looking at these empires, one has to be very cognizant of their power and their ruthlessness. Otherwise, they would not be empires. And the Assyrian Empire was no different. Now, he also tells us, but then the Assyrian kings were brutal by modern standards. To be sure, the Assyrian kings were, but they did not invent cruelty. Their use of terror was part of a calculated political strategy. Certainly not what Toynbee and others were saying, one shared with other empires of the ancient world. So here he's saying, this is, of course, 10 years after, more than 10 years, 11 years after writing the first article. One shared with other empires of the ancient world, and their civilization was also marked by impressive intellectual, artistic, and administrative achievements. And again, this is in the companion to Assyria, but when we see in his book, Assyria, the first empire, world's first empire, now we see a different tone, and we're going to go over that in the very near future. What about Assyrian art? Just to kind of close here, there's a wonderful article written by a couple of scholars that is about Winckelmann in Nineveh, Assyrian remains in the age of the classics. And what this article talks about is how Assyrian art began to be viewed when it was first discovered and how it began to be viewed later on. So Winckelmann was a German historian and archaeologist who's considered the kind of the modern founder of modern art, and art in his mind had kind of a development, and it reached its highest age in the classical age, particularly Greek age. The general characteristics of the Greek masterpieces are a noble simplicity and a quiet grandeur. Okay, so thinking like this, other historians, when they discovered Assyrian artifacts, said things like this, and among them was Jacob Burckhardt. The utterly uncouth royal fortress of Nineveh, the meanness of their ground plan, and the slavishness of their sculptures. So Assyrian art was associated with a very primitive state, a very undesirable state, but Greek art and classical art was seen as something that was beautiful and developed and sophisticated. Again, this viewed through this Eurocentric Orientalist viewpoint. And people like Layard initially viewed Assyrian art in the same way, but then later Layard changed, and he says, to those who have been accustomed to look upon the Greeks and as the true perfecters and the only masters of imitative arts, they, when Botta was finding his ruins, the Assyrian ruins, will furnish new matter. And these are the pieces at the Louvre in France, in Paris, France. They will furnish new matter for inquiry and reflection. The extreme beauty and elegance of the various objects introduced on the groups are next to be admired, all designed with the most consummate taste that rival the production of the most cultivated period of Greek art. So we have a different way, again, of looking at Assyrian art.